okay, I'm the person who was just introduced. Okay, I'm Ji-Hyang Jang, and obviously I'm working on the Islamic extremism. And recently we had a kind of latest Fed term like CVE, countering violent extremism, that President Obama kind of invented. So these days, we researchers kind of tend to use, both like Islamic extremism and also violent extremism. So okay, I was informed that I have about 45 minutes for my lecture. So let me cover ISIS, violent extremism, and Korea, which is today's issue, and then okay, and I will go over 4 different points about Islamic extremism and ISIS and Korea and the international community. Okay, before me jumping into the issue, okay, I got my degree from the University of Texas at Austin because one of my mentor professors in Korea wanted me to study about more, I don't know, like fancier things like international economy of oil or something. So I went there because Texas is just whatever producing oil, but somehow I got fascinated by political Islam, and then Islamic finance and democratization. So I just end up studying about political Islam in Turkey and Egypt. And now I will talk about ISIS. Okay, the first thing that I like to cover first is about ISIS. I will talk about Islamic extremism in general, and the third generation of Islamic radicalism, which is the ISIS in specific. And then I will introduce the ongoing dispute about resilience of ISIS, because there's very hot debate going on right now in the field. I mean, is the ISIS is really resilient and popular, and the whatever international coalition against ISIS cannot really beat those guys up or not. And my assessment is not really. I don't think ISIS is that strong or mighty or resilient. But I rather think that the ISIS is just kind of a bunch of guys based on internet and with very weak leadership groups. And I'm pretty sure that you have many counter arguments against my assessment. And the third point is like, okay, so I mean, we are so tired of being told about ISIS. I mean, every day we talked about, we were told about ISIS and ISIS and ISIS. And last week we were informed that one of a Korean teenager, the Kim Gun, who voluntarily joined ISIS this January, and kind of we have not really true yet, but kind of speculation about his death. So then what does the international community do in order to respond to ISIS? I mean, is there something that the international community is doing to, I don't know, fight them? So the third point is about response to the response of the international community to Islamic extremism or the ISIS. And the final point is about the relationship between ISIS, Korea, and the international community, if there's any. I strongly think that there is a strong relationship. The future of ISIS and the global status of Korea, but I was not that successful in persuading that relationship's presence, though. All right. Okay, let me start with the rationality of societarianism, because this particular kind of terrorism really holds the gist of, terrorism or extremism. Okay, we often think that, those just crazy fanatic Muslims just someday decide to wear, the bombing jacket and just decide to kill her or himself. So we really don't think that those suicide attackers are really, rational enough. But it's not that true. Even though those suicide terrorist attacker himself or herself, individually, may be irrational or fanatic, but in the level of leadership groups, societarianism is very rational act. It's very rationally calculated political behavior. Okay, it is really rational because first, imagine that you are one of the leadership groups in the ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Taliban. You don't want to imagine that, but let's imagine. Then you made one of the members die. Attacking some important place or some important, usually place, not really persons or people. Then you don't have to really worry about the following rescue operation because one or two of your members just accomplished his or her mission and just died there. And also you don't have to worry about any information leaks because again, people just go die there and mission just accomplished. So in terms of, it's very scary and brutal things to say, but in terms of at least those two strengths, the societarianism is a very rational act and very strategic logic, strategically calculated coercive instrument of choice. So again, in summary, societarianism, which is the very, which holds the very gist of terrorist logic, is not really just fanaticism, but very rational act, especially designed to coerce modern liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is such an optimal target for societarists because first, liberal democracy has very open, plural society, so that those terrorist members just very easily go sneak around and penetrate into the society. Whenever I go to my field, where there are so many, authoritarian countries, so I just wanted to go to the parliamentary library, but I need to go through at least 5 or 6 times of security check. If you go to the authoritarian regime, there are so many security checks and everywhere. But if you go to democratic countries, then not really many security check or secret police or other hardcore state apparatus much. So it's so easy for terrorists go and do their missions. And secondly, it's so easy to hold hostage from democratic countries rather than dictatorial regimes because the politicians in democratic countries are so prone to the pressure from the public opinions because there's strong, relationship between, being responsive to citizens' demand and the possibility of being re-elected. So, given the electoral mechanisms, the democratic politicians need to listen to, at least pretend to listen to citizens' demand. So the politicians must show that I do have a responsibility to protect our own citizens. So if you're one of those, ISIS members, you don't want to have, hostage from dictatorial regime or North Korean citizens, but rather South Korean citizens, so that you can, again, achieve your goal. Okay, speaking of goal, so what is the goal of those Islamic extremists or violent extremists? By the way, let me start with the bottom line. The essence of demonstrative terrorism. Okay, demonstrative terrorism is the very key characteristics of terrorism or extremism. The essence of terrorism is not, lots of people dying, but rather lots of people watching. So many experts says that terrorists just want to have a huge theater. They really don't want to see lots of people just dead, but rather they're just so hungry for attention or publicity from the international community. They wanted people to think about why those people do that. So, another criminal activity is really, criminal activity is really bad activity, but it's different from terrorist activity. Because terrorist activity is so aiming at gaining publicity and attention. Okay, let me go up and start with the first sentence. Okay, the invention of societarianism or sustainability of terrorism has changed the power configuration of international relations. Why does that so? Okay, during the Cold War, the co-author with influential power, with a strong military power, with a strong economic power, is the strong state. Mainly from the developed countries. And of course, the target was the weaker one. But after the Cold War, there's no, dichotomous, tension anymore. Then the co-author is the weaker actor, mainly the terrorists who are originated from the not developed countries. And the target is the stronger one. So the power configuration just went up the opposite way. So again, the key characteristics of terrorism is the demonstrative terrorism, which is directed at gaining publicity in order to recruit more people and to gain more attention from the international community. And let me just briefly introduce the history of Islamic extremism or Islamic radicals or jihadists. Okay, the first generation of Islamic radicals start from probably 1940s. So I shouldn't not really label them as radicals. They were Islamic fundamentalists. They wanted to build Islamic state based on Sharia and not many of them really wanted to use forces and violence. And the main target of the first generation was near enemy, meaning that their main target was their own dictators, like Egyptian dictator or Tunisia dictator or Algerian dictator, not really the evil empire America. And most of them were relatively highly educated with middle class background. But what happened during the 1980s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States government decided to encourage many those Islamic fundamentalists to join the Afghan war to fight against the Soviet Union. Then the radicalization movement just started. So have you ever heard about Mujahideen? So Mujahideen is the very first phenomenon of global jihadists. So many Mujahideen warriors who fought against the Soviet Union were not only from Afghan, but also from Syria, Saudi, Libya, Jordan, Algeria, those neighboring Muslim countries. So the second generation of political Islam just started from the post-Cold War era. And the main target of the second generation was obviously far enemy, the evil empire, the United States, because the United States just harshly, brutally betrayed those Mujahideen warriors. The US government strongly supported the Mujahideen warriors when they were fighting against the Soviet Union, but when the Cold War was over, the United States just suddenly stopped supporting. Then Osama bin Laden and other, ex-Mujahideen warriors feel so isolated and so betrayed, and they decide to organize what? Al-Qaeda. And the profiling of the second generation was very changed, transformed and very different from the first generation. It's much more hard for intelligence, authority or CIA to track the members of the second generation of political Islam because, for the first generation, there are so many, doctors or, medical doctors, engineers, and middle class, people. But for the second generation, just so much mixed, characteristics. There are many people who are uneducated, educated, unemployed, employed, socially isolated, integrated, unmarried, married, young, middle, male or female. But the one common thing that unites them is they are very radicalized. They are radical. They don't care about their own Muslim dictators anymore. They strongly believe that all the messy things were happening in the Middle East is just because of the United States. But, radical people usually are not really supported by the citizens or the mass or the people. So Al-Qaeda was not that popular group at all. They were very international, very global, but I'm sure that, we experts conclude that Al-Qaeda is such a marginalized, small portion of just subgroups of political Islam. That's why they decide to make big event, which is 9/11 terror, because they know that they are losing their support from the mass because they are so radical. So they decide to make just big show. So they did that. And, every people just got shocked when Al-Qaeda decide to do 9/11 terror, but then, compared to these days, ISIS terror, I think 9/11 terror is just like joke, because ISIS is just so much radicalized, so brutal, and Al-Qaeda decide to, cut their relationship with ISIS just because ISIS is way extremely brutal. So the ISIS, the new generation, the third generation of political Islam, has kind of 4 different characteristics. First, they are extremely global. They are much more global than Al-Qaeda. And they are even globally literate. Okay, they are very SNS and business savvy, and they are multilingual, and they are multinational. Okay, there are about 20,000 foreign fighters within the ISIS right now, and their nationality is more than 90 different countries, including South Korea. And therefore, usually people think that, okay, political Islam is so, community-driven, so parochial, so nationalistic groups. But not anymore, because ISIS is so global. There are no more they don't empathize tribalization anymore, and they are not parochial anymore, because they have 90 different nationality within their organizations, and they are rich. Secondly, they're earning their assets through oil, black market, and other antiques, black market, smuggling, and kidnapping, and forced taxation. And thirdly, again, they're ultra violent. And they just usually do arbitrary and mass execution. They just, behead people's head, and they just burn people, and they just drown people. And even though they use very high technology, whatever SNS and internet things themselves, but they just chop off people's arms and hands if and when they use cell phones. You just name it. It's really hard to even describe how brutal they are. So they are ultra violent. And finally, they act like state actor. They try to provide law and order, of course, based on their own doctrinate interpretation. And they also try to provide public services, again, based on their own interpretation. Okay, so let's move on to the second point. So, is this ISIS guys, ISIS people, so really resilient and influential and very strong? Or this group is just very decentralized, internet-driven terrorist, gatherings? I buy second point, and I will tell you why. Okay, ISIS is not that resilient, but rather just transient group, because first, their leadership is very weak. In terms of cohesiveness, their central leadership is just very mixture of Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party members, ex-Saddam Hussein officials, and very doctrinate jihadists. Socialists and those fanatics cannot really get along very well for a long time. But they do right now, because they have their common enemy, which is Shiite Baghdad central government. And secondly, because they are so ultra-violent, even Sunni tribes don't like them. So there are already very strong backlash from the Sunni tribes shocked by ISIS brutality. But again, as I told you before, I know that you have very strong counter-argument against my assessment. First, okay, if ISIS is not that strong and not that resilient, not that influential, then why so many youngsters all over the world wanted to join the ISIS? Okay, I buy that counter-argument. And I also buy that we will see more, teenagers who wanted to join the ISIS. But that doesn't mean that ISIS has very strong, organized central leadership at all. Just because of that kind of recruitment, ISIS, the central leadership will be challenged from the bottom. Okay, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the term echo chamber effect, which is very related to the internet stuff. It's a very latest fancy word. And I will explain what the echo chamber effect is. Okay, usually the very interactive exchanges in the chatting room serves as echo chamber effect. Meaning that you select the chatting room you wanted to go or you wanted to join. Therefore, the distorted opinions is getting more distorted. That's the echo chamber effect. So the self-selected interactive exchanges in a chatting room radicalize the young Muslims more collectively. Okay, meaning that you just decide to join whatever ISIS follower chatting room. And there are so many ISIS loving people talking. But then you think that I kind of don't agree with them. But you cannot really say that because you don't want to say that. So you just decide to leave the chatting room. Then the people who just staying in the chatting room is getting more radicalized because there's no other alternative opinions. So that's the collective radicalization through interactive internet exchanges. Okay, let me explain more. So the recruiting mechanism for the ISIS is very different from the traditional one. I mean, for the Al-Qaeda people, they just wanted to recruit people through face-to-face interaction. I mean, which is a very traditional and conventional one. But for the ISIS, the leadership group doesn't have to do that because there is very strong, trend of bottom-up, self-recruiting, a system. So the central leadership doesn't have to worry about, gathering people because the youngsters, they just decide to join the ISIS through internet, through interactive exchanges in the chatting room. Which means that this kind of internet egalitarianism eventually hurt the central leadership of ISIS. Because they think that they are the self-owner of the group. And those the old gangsters didn't have to do much. And we observe that kind of, like the internet cracks right now within the internet. And it's kind of oxymoron to say this, but due to those decentralization, ISIS seems like very fast, meaning that these days, these sub-networks, subgroups of ISIS operate more independently in the day-to-day operations. So usually, in the organization, the central leadership groups decide which subgroup attacks when and what. That's the organizational capacity. But ISIS doesn't do that, because the sub-networks are very autonomous, very independent, and very influential, and they don't listen to the central leadership. And they are the very group who said that they don't want to follow the Al-Qaeda's order anymore. The origins of ISIS is the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay, and second possible counter-argument against my assessment is that, well, these days we are observing the new trend of ISIS franchisation, right? We heard that there's Egyptian branches of ISIS and Algeria branch of ISIS and Libya branch of ISIS. And we also heard that there's so many lone wolf attacks in the European countries and in Canada, Australia, and after they attacked some symbolic places, and they claimed that they kind of represent ISIS, right? But then why I saying that ISIS is not that resilient? Okay, regarding the ISIS franchisation phenomena, okay, the franchisation phenomena in the Middle East is due to the military groups, again, seeking to co-opt the ISIS brand for their own publicity. I mean, the Egyptian branch of ISIS was there. 10 years ago, I know them. And that group is the very terrorist group who operated the suicide bombing attack against the Korean tourist bus. I just suddenly forgot their Al-Maqdis are, they were there 10 years ago, but they just decide to change their head so that they can get more attention and more people. And also the Libyan branch of ISIS was there right after the Libyan civil war. They are Al-Maqdis, al-Sharia or something. But then they just decide to change their head. And they say that, well, we are the Libyan branch of ISIS. So it seems like ISIS is expanding their stronghold into Libya, Algeria, and Egypt. But those militant groups were there already. And also ISIS franchisation in the European countries are due to the domestic criminals who just wanted to legitimize their actions using the brand of ISIS. They're just anarchists or criminals or gangsters who were already there, but then they just decide to utilize the popularity of ISIS so that they can, legitimize their action. So that's my interpretation about the ISIS franchisation phenomena. And the third possible counter-argument about the ISIS is that the ISIS is kind of popular in the territory of Syria and Iraq that ISIS controlled right now. Okay, some people say that ISIS seems like popular because the people there are just so sick of the U.S. influence or the Assad or those Muslim dictators. So they might buy the idea of ISIS about, the new caliph era or something. But I don't think so. Usually in a very repressive, very coercive, very brutal, very fierce atmosphere, people never ever express their genuine, preference, but just they tell lie. I don't think people in the North Korea really loved Kim Jong-un at all. But, you cannot say that. You cannot say that you hate Kim Jong-un, because if you say so, there's something happen. So this is the very gist of distorted public opinions and falsified preference in a dictatorial regime. Okay, so again, in summary, my assessment about ISIS is that those leaderless jihadists with decentralized bottom-up self-recruiting members will fade away, but they never ever be gone totally. That's impossible. So eventually, ISIS will be deteriorated into a marginalized group with a scattered network, performing very sporadic attacks against democracies. Because, again, democracy is such a feasible target due to their open system and obligation to protect their own citizens. So we need to live with that, because we are living in the era of post-Cold War. Okay, about the global response to countering violent extremism or responding ISIS. Okay, from 2014 and by 2015, more than 60 countries have joined the anti-ISIS international coalition, and about 20 countries have pledged military assistance, and about 30 countries, including Korea and Japan, pledged humanitarian assistance only. And the United States right now, conducting airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq with European countries and Western countries, and in Syria with Arab countries. And you can see the difference. So the Western countries only bomb ISIS in Iraq, but Arab countries only bomb the ISIS in Syria. Why? I tell you why. And that's why the coalition is not that strong and not that influential. ISIS is really the only thing. The hatred against ISIS is the only thing which unites, Sunni and Shiite, and Iran and Saudi, and China and United States, and China and Japan, and you name it, just like Erdogan of Turkey and Assad and Syria. Everybody hates ISIS. Everybody. But then, why we don't expect more increased cooperation within those, global actors? Okay, first, because people, those countries have their own agendas, and their interests are totally different from each other. Even though there's one common thing which unites them. They hate ISIS, but they think that their own agenda and interest is more important than their hatred toward ISIS. Okay, Sunni allies hate U.S. strategy against Assad regime and toward Iran. Okay, U.S. right now is pursuing strategic cooperation with Iran, and those Sunni Arab allies just hate United States' new pivot to Iran strategy. And secondly, Turkey is selectively supporting only the Iraqi Kurdish forces, not Syrian Kurdish, not Kurds within Turkey. And also, Turkey is arguing that the global community fights both ISIS and Assad regime at the same time. Because many anti-Assad coalition members think that, the current humanitarian crisis is happening due to first ISIS and also Assad regime. And that is very true, I think. And also many think that the humanitarian crisis is happening because of, inconsistent foreign policy of Obama administration as well. Okay, again, in those Western countries, European countries and Canada and Australia have not conducted operation over Syria, whereas Sunni Arab countries have not conducted operation over Iraq because, no, I didn't say because. Okay, because, those, multilateralism-driven European countries think that, they cannot bomb Syria because there's no official request from the Assad regime. And those Sunni Arabs do not conduct operation over Iraq because they don't like those Shiite Baghdad central government. But Australia, this month, last month, decided to bomb the ISIS stronghold in Syria as well, even though Australia authorities argue that they don't have, still the international legal, background doing that, but they decide to do so. Why? The recent humanitarian crisis of migrants and refugees, fleeing ISIS and Assad and pouring into Europe. And that was the trigger. And France decided to join the bombing over Syria too. So maybe we might witness new changes. But then Russia decided to help, Assad regime. And so the final point is what I think is very important. Of course, there's no sole military solution in fight against ISIS. That's for sure. We need more political and diplomatic solution. But no solution without, military action either. Right? If you really wanted to crack down those such crazy ultra-violent extremism groups, then you must show your military power against them. Okay, I have 5 more minutes. ISIS, Korea, and the international community. So do you think that there is strong relationship between Korea and ISIS? I think I'm one of really, really few people in Korea who think that there is. Okay, I will tell you why. Okay, Korea has been pursuing middle power foreign policy to promote international norms and principles and mediate international disputes. Korea government does so not because Korea government loves peace and global prosperity, but because Korea needs global support when we are dealing with North Korea. So the Korean government is kind of doing investment. So in 2014, Korea Foreign Ministry donated some, humanitarian money, but not much, especially compared to that of Japan. But I think it was a very good start. I mean, Korea never ever showed those kind of, very active humanitarianism-driven, global donation whatsoever. But then last year was the very, turning point. So even Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se declared that he wants to visit Erbil and beg that to show his support to those government who are fighting against ISIS. And it was a really good step, I think. But what happened? This year, this January, there was Japanese hostage crisis. Even though Japan's role was very limited to humanitarian assistance in the anti-ISIS international coalition, just like Korea. And right after the 2015 Japanese hostage killing by ISIS, what happened in Korea? Suddenly there's strong argument such as don't mess with terrorists, don't provoke terrorists, don't invite terrorists, and don't do much, even humanitarian assistance related to the fight against ISIS, because we are not ready to do that, or there are so many Korean, businessmen and workers in the Middle East. And of course, there are still, live pursuing middle power policy and following international norms arguments against those new arguments. And those don't mess with the terrorist argument is very understandable. I mean, I do understand because Koreans just went through those, very horrible, hostage killings and other incidents, like from 2004 and 2007, 2009, and last year. And the Egyptian tourist suicide bombing attack was done by the Egyptian ISIS branch. And of course, I really do understand the foreign ministry's concern about the safety of Koreans, especially abroad. And protecting the safety of Koreans abroad is one of the foreign minister's key tasks. Absolutely. And I am one of those foreign ministry's counselor. So I do buy their argument. But I really wanted to ask a question regarding, is there really strong and direct causal relationship between, adhering to international norms and principles and being a target of terrorism and a passive diplomatic posture and protecting its own citizens? I'm not sure, but I kind of doubt that. But I know that there is very strong argument against, pursuing middle power foreign policy because we need to protect our own citizens. But, Korea stands to lose significant its standing if it adopts more passive foreign policy. That's for sure, right? And its credibility will be damaged within the global community. If Korea does not really uphold the international norms and principles, like fighting against ISIS, then Korea will definitely encounter setbacks when we really need the help from the global community when we are dealing with North Korea. like a few days ago, President Park had whatever speech at the UN Assembly, and she again asked the global support and global help when Korea is pursue the peaceful unification when dealing with those crazy Kim Jong-un regime in North Korea. But we found out that the issue of North Korea is not even one of the 10 important global issues at the UN Assembly. The number one issue was Syria. Number two issue was Iran. So I strongly believe that we Koreans must show our support toward those 2 or 3 important global issues, and then we can ask global support when we are dealing with the crazy Kim Jong-un regime. So maybe the third argument is kind of sounds a bit irresponsible, but that's really true. I mean, terrorists wanted to capture public's attention and publicity, and democracies are just so vulnerable to such attacks in the short term. Again, we need to live with that. So, again, those global norms, such as fighting against terrorism, is the basis of Korea's foreign policy toward North Korea as well, right? So when Korea government decide to do more eagerly with that kind of global issues, then it may incur short-term cost, but in the long term, foreign policy, like a middle power foreign policy, will serve Korea's national interest by winning, hearts and minds of the international community, and of course, trust and support for a future peaceful unification. Thank you.